So I was saying that I will do a quick presentation, very brief, to just kind of give us an overview of this topic, and then we will go deeper after we hear from our two panelists, and then we will have a discussion as a group. We actually had the vision that it would be more of a round table with everyone kind of facing each other, but hopefully we can make the arrangement work for us. So first we're going to have our two panelists introduce themselves before I make my brief remarks.
Hi, my name is Josie Mooney, and I grew up in Chicago. I'll tell you a little bit about that later, and I am an organizer. That's what I've done for the last 35 years.
And my name is Brenton Mock. I am a journalist. I write for grist.org, and I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I live in Washington, D.C. right now. And thank you, Jackie, for inviting me to be on this panel, and thank you all for coming out.
So given the need to use the mic and the need to run the slides at the same time, which are all the way over there, I might see if someone would be able to, you will, okay. So we actually, do you remember where it should start? It's kind of way down where it said profits before people, yep, it's considerably, yeah, thank you. Okay, whoops, back. Yeah, great, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little, like I said, I'm going to talk very big picture about just some of the relationships, unfortunately, between how our demo. Oh, okay, you want to see too? Okay, good. All right, I felt abandoned. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit big picture about how some of our democracy is being overrun by corporate interest, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the voter disenfranchisement specifically here. So next slide. This is a quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of their reports. Due to the lack of government action, expensive, unproven, delusional ways to manage carbon emissions, such as controversial geoengineering techniques, remain part of the global discussion. So again, they're really calling out the fact that special interests are in fact ruling our decisions that are getting us into a deeper hole than we already even are as it relates to climate change. Next slide. This is just a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. All progress is precarious, and the solution of one problem brings us face to face with another problem. And this is by the International Forum on Globalization. I was impressed by the creativity there. So they call this the Kochtopus. And it talks about all the influence of the Koch brothers, how they managed to fuel money to manipulate the media, into think tanks, into Congress itself, into the courtrooms in terms of buying courtroom decisions, and then into our universities even. I was actually doing a talk at one university. I'll leave their name out for their own sake. But after I finished the talk, one of the students walked up to me and she's like, "We actually get so many millions of dollars from the Koch brothers, and we're starting a stealth campaign." So she was really kind of calling out the fact that she sees even in her own education the influence of the Koch brothers, but how fortunately there is student activism to address that issue. So that was encouraging. Thank you. She's moving me along. So this next slide is, you might not be able to read it necessarily, but this is a list of the quote-unquote think tanks that are getting money from the Koch brothers. And that's the amounts on the right side. And in the middle are the number of pro-Keystone XL mentions that they have in their quote-unquote research and analysis that's coming out, where they're saying that Keystone XL pipeline is actually a good thing. In total, there's 944 mentions that are saying in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline, and they're getting $52 million. This is just in 1 year alone from the Koch brothers. Next slide. Thank you. She's multitasking. Oh, pardon? Yes, great. And this is, so Rabbi Waskow, I don't know if you mentioned you're with Interfaith Moral Action on Climate Change, but we both are on the steering committee of Interfaith Moral Action on Climate Change. And this is us in front of the American Petroleum Institute saying, API, it's immoral to wreck our planet with your dirty fossil fuels. And we, again, are really calling for, and Rabbi Waskow will talk more about the Move Our Money, Protect Our Planet campaign that we have going around this. So This is another quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. Law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. Yes. And then this slide shows a list of the various congressional representatives who get money from the Koch brothers and how much money they get, and the number of all the times that they voted in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline. And as you see down the line, it's just yes, 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 all the way down in terms of voting in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline. All of them, pretty much except for two, signed a letter to President Obama encouraging him to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. And it just, again, shows that kind of tie between who they're supporting and who the Koch brothers are supporting and what their voting records are in conjunction there. So the next slide is a little bit of somewhat comic relief and somewhat sobering relief. So she's going to switch us out and play this video that I've queued up for us. Hopefully that will go smoothly. Oh, it's actually, is it still? I think I already have the browser under the internet. Yeah. Yep, on the left. And then, yep, thank you. She's good.
Andrew. Sandy. Ivan. Katrina. Since 1954, the World Meteorological Organization has been naming hurricanes and tropical storms. But what did these people do to deserve having their names attached to this? As climate change continues to create more frequent and devastating storms, we propose a new naming system. One that names extreme storms after policymakers who deny climate change. We propose something like this.
Senator Marco Rubio is expected to pound the eastern seaboard sometime early tonight. Windows are being opened up and grocery stores are virtually empty as Marco Rubio threatens everything in his path.
Now, Michelle Bachmann is on the way, folks, and specifically the eye of Michelle Bachmann will be hitting Florida in a few hours.
Michelle Bachmann is incredibly dangerous. If you value your life, please seek shelter from Michelle Bachmann.
Senator David Vitter is turning out to be one of the hugest and costliest disasters in American history.
Literally lifting boats out of the water and tossing them onto the land.
Local animal shelters are under pressure as thousands of animals have been displaced or killed by Governor Rick Perry.
We can't even take care of the animals that we've rescued, and so some of them are going to have to be put down, all because of Rick Perry.
We've been here for 2 days because of Congressman Paul Ryan. I have friends still out there. It's scary because I have no idea what Paul Ryan could be doing to them right now.
Senator James Inhofe has turned out to be a worst-case scenario come true, and now an entire nation is wondering how they'll ever recover from the disaster that is James Inhofe.
If you think that it's time for a naming system that names extreme storms caused by climate change after policymakers who deny climate change, sign the petition at climatenamechange.org before John Boehner blows your entire city away.
So, as you see, so it really puts in somewhat humorous but real terms like the results of not having folks who are making decisions in our interests, and so the relationships there. So we'll talk a lot more about what that actually looks like at the community level. And this is a list of the lobbying that has been lobbying amounts that have been spent just in 1 year in 2010 by these various corporations, and we're looking at the corporations who own coal-fired power plants, and a lot of the lobbying is focused on anti-regulations like the carbon pollution standards, the mercury and air toxics rules, which are some of the standards around coal-fired power plants. We ourselves were involved. We were represented by a group called Earth Justice where us, the Sierra Club, and other groups had an injunction while these fossil fuel companies were suing the EPA around the mercury and air toxics Toxics Rule, which were the first ever rules under the Clean Air Act to protect communities from the pollution in terms of mercury, arsenic, lead, all these toxic pollutants. And so, and we had to be involved in this injunction against the fossil fuel companies who were trying to get the EPA to not protect us from those toxins. So, thanks. And so those were just some of the other folks and the amounts they were spending on this. And then just looking at the amount of money that the CEOs are making at these companies. Meanwhile, whenever you want to do something to actually make the something like controlling the pollution or transitioning to clean energy, it's always this litany around. Well, this is going to have to go to the ratepayers. It's going to have to go to the ratepayers. Meanwhile, these types of compensation packages are being paid to the CEO. So we really want to see this kind of whole relationship between the decisions are being made, who's being impacted, and who's gaining the profits from it. So, and then just more on that, the average CEO compensation was $9.8 million compared to the average worker who made $33,840, which is 289 times the amount of the average worker. So again, anyway, on that grim note, we are going to turn to our panelists, but that's just kind of to give us a big picture overview, and we're really going to talk a little bit more about what this actually means, particularly in the South, and how we can, and most importantly, how we as a group and as individuals working in our various sectors can make a change around this. So, thank you.
I just want to tell you that Jackie is one of the most awesome people doing work in this arena in the country. She is an amazing organizer, and she also really understands the science. And so I want to thank her for both the presentation and also for your work.
Thank you. So Josie requested to go last, if you don't mind.
Because I read your article, and you're much smarter than me.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I want you to start.
No pressure on me. So just start anywhere?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, the way that I just kind of want to talk about how I fell into environmental justice and whose shoulders I stand upon, and and that I study, and that I hope to try to share and uplift and highlight to the rest of the nation through my blog at grist.org and other voices that I also try to help bring to the forefront. I started off not knowing anything about the environment, at least in any professional or formal kind of way. I reported on race for much of my career. I worked at Southern Poverty Law Center, where I investigated hate groups, like the Ku Klux Klan and skinheads, neo-Nazis. That got really taxing, and it also felt really distant, because the Klan kind of felt like some boogeyman out there who, historically has done a lot of, as an organization, has done a lot of really bad things to people of color, but the kinds of things that actually were impacting the lives of people of color today, on a systemic basis and on a structural basis, it wasn't that much. It wasn't the Klan, right? It was people who lived close to, who lived on the fence line of polluting factories. It was people who were being left out of the benefits of new and emerging clean energy markets. It was people who were being left out of just basic benefits that should be provided by the federal government, such as low-income heating assistance and grants for weatherizing your homes. So I made a transition to environmental reporting through a program called the Metcalf Institute, which was looking to create more diversity among environmental reporters. There's not a lot of environmental reporters of color in the journalism industry. And I learned a lot about the science of, of climate change, what was causing it, what was exacerbating it, what the possible solutions were, the delusions of geoengineering. But it still felt really distant. I mean, these weren't things I could go home and talk to my parents about in a way where they could actually feel it, today. And that's when I began to, I stumbled upon environmental justice. At the academic realm, I stumbled upon the work of Dr. Robert Bullard, who's considered, one of the, or considered the father of environmental justice, but also the work of a lot of other people such as Beverly Wright, Vernice Miller Travis, so many. I mean, there's a huge realm of scholarship around environmental justice, and it seemed to me that it wasn't getting the proper gravity and seriousness in the mainstream media, or any media, or not much media at all. And so I wanted to kind of bring these voices to the forefront, as a way of kind of speaking about how these environmental issues affected people in low-income communities and people of color. Started reporting on these things for a magazine called American Prospect in Washington, D.C. And I worked with some really great journalists at the time there. I mean, Ezra Klein, who just started Vox, Ann Friedman, who works for New York Magazine, Adam Sewer, who's at MSNBC right now. I mean, it was a really great time because we were all young and we were all just kind of learning about policy and learning about all of these different things that impact, people who are most vulnerable and who need the most help. In that learning, I learned that, that the federal government actually has policies for addressing environmental justice, that environmental justice advocates push the federal government to address the fact that environmental pollution was having a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities. And they really pushed the federal government to do something about that, which I think has a direct tie to why we're here for this Freedom Summer event, right? I mean, it's all about people who, took matters into their own hand when they saw the vulnerabilities that were happening to people of color, and pushing the federal government to create laws to bring equal protection for all people. Environmental justice advocates did the same thing. It was an extension of the Civil Rights Act. They pushed for President Clinton to sign what's called the Executive Order 12898, which in theory says that, well, not in theory, which says that all federal department agencies must consider the impacts of their decisions and rulemaking and permitting on communities of color before implementing them. And they created an Office of Environmental Justice, formerly Office of Environmental Equity, but then it became Office of Environmental Justice within the EPA. And there's a long history of, again, just people pushing for the federal government to create these protections for people of color. And I think that there was a huge culmination that happened in 2009 or 2010 when President Barack Obama appointed Lisa Jackson, the first African-American woman to head EPA, and she made environmental justice a priority in her administration. And I think that's no small thing right there. I mean, I think that's monumental to me. I mean, that's for me a direct point from what happened in Freedom Summer all the way to what's going on today, that we had someone at the cabinet level who has made a priority that we must have equal protection for all communities, that Black and Latino communities should not have to bear the brunt of pollution, whether that's from local coal power plants or whether it's from climate change. I mean, that's a direct testament to people power right there. So that's the bulk of just kind of what I cover when I'm at grist.org, just really trying to lift up the voices and the people who made that happen, because it shouldn't be taken for granted. A president could come in 2016 and wipe it all away. And, we kind of owe it to the people who fought for this to really preserve it and to strengthen it, quite frankly. And so a lot of what I write about is also about environmental law, the application of Title VI under the Civil Rights Act, also the plans that EPA has put in place to, again, to strengthen environmental protections through their Plan EJ 2014. I lived in New Orleans for 4 years, so I spent a few years doing a lot of reporting on the environmental impacts of things like Hurricane Katrina, the failure of the levees, really, the BP oil disaster. And one of my greatest reporting trips was when I went with Jackie. It was shortly after you became the director of NAACP's Climate Change Director. We traveled out to the beach. Where did we go? We went out to basically Ground Zero. Grand Isle, yes, where most of the oil was collecting right after the BP disaster. To hear directly from the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, and also the people living there about what was going on with the oil and with the dispersants, and also where the waste was going, right? Because they collected the oil through the booms, like where that waste was being transported to, because there were a lot of concerns that where that waste was being deposited, where it happened to be in places like here in Mississippi and throughout Louisiana, where African Americans of low income lived in close proximity. So, these are great times. I'm happy to be here and happy to take any questions after all of this is said and done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, thank you all for coming. It means a lot that there's a lot of places you could have been on a weekend like today, and that you chose to be here and participate in this. Can you hear me now? Participate in this weekend is a testimony to your vision and your work. And it's been my really greatest honor to be here. And for that, I thank Jackie for inviting me to participate in this panel, and also my friend Derek Johnson for the work that he does here in Mississippi and for the NAACP nationally. So I grew up in a white suburb of Chicago and called Winnetka, Illinois. I don't admit this very often in groups like this, because Winnetka, Illinois was notably, in the time in which I grew up, pretty wealthy, virtually 100% white, and I went to the third best high school in the country, called New Trier High School, and it was public. And where I went to high school, you got to have 5 years of Chinese or 5 years of French. We had a big swimming pool and a beautiful gym and a track. And I didn't know anything about race or class until I went to Chicago to spend a week at Calumet High School, which was all black, and they didn't have any books, and they had bars on their windows, and they didn't have enough desks or chairs. And I'd never seen anything like that contrast, because I'd never been out of Winnetka, Illinois. And I came home and I said to my mother, I don't understand. How come I get to go to my high school and those kids have to go to their high school? And she said, it's none of your concern. So I've spent the last 35 years trying to figure out why I got to go to my high school and those kids had to go to their high school, and what we can all collectively do about it. And the answer to that, of course, is we have to build power. And people who have power don't give it up very easily. So I became a teacher and I joined the union. I thought maybe if I practiced good education, I became a special ed teacher, and I did that for a couple of years, and I went on strike for a month, my first year of teaching. And I learned a lot about collective action, and decided I should learn more about collective action, and there are two people here in the room who taught me about that when I was a young organizer and started out in 1975, and that's Mike Miller and Heather Booth, who are at the back of the room. They really taught me how to organize, and I want to thank them and others who have been here publicly for giving me a start. I've been a union organizer for the last 25 years, and I really didn't know much about environmental organizing. I thought, I believed in saving the whales, and I didn't like that the ice was melting. I didn't know what I could do about it. And frankly, I was a little arrogant enough to think that doing union organizing was more important, because we were organizing real people around real issues in real communities, and we had a diverse organization that we were building with our allies in the community, trying to build power. Until Katrina happened, and then Sandy, and then the typhoon in the Philippines, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, rather late in life, that the same communities that we were trying to organize in the labor movement, the same people who were trying to organize now around $15 in the fast food campaign, were the very same people who were being disproportionately hurt, whose communities were being destroyed by climate change. And I ran into a guy named Tom Steyer, who is a San Francisco philanthropist, which is where I live now, and he was working on a proposition to close a tax loophole. He had done one earlier, and I started learning from him about climate change. And he started something called Next Gen Climate, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But I learned that there's a lot we need to all be doing together. So what's the problem? I mean, both of my panelists know a lot more about the problem than I do. And I'd refer you all to this new report that just came out this week called Risky Business. You can get it online, and it was produced by Tom Steyer, a Democrat, Hank Paulson, clearly a Republican, and Mike Bloomberg. I guess he's an independent, right? And together, they each put up money to do this very comprehensive study. And when you read it, and I hope you will, it's terrifying. It basically puts out, region by region, what's going to happen if we don't do anything. It talks about sea level rise. It talks about the impact of extraordinary heat and the number of days that human beings will not be able to go outside for months at a time, and the impact that that has on our health and our well-being. And it talks about the future of the planet, and it does it in a very dispassionate way. It's just the facts, because the three of them couldn't agree on what the solutions were. So I would ask that you read that. If we don't act now, there's going to be lost lives and livelihood and devastated businesses and homes, and the food supplies will be eliminated, and there'll be food inflation, and there'll be billions of dollars spent in emergency response, and it's a threat to national security. One of the things that Tom Steyer has done is he hired a Navy SEAL, former Navy SEAL, to go to one of the pipelines in the country and see whether or not it would be possible to do very easily damage, significant damage. And he said he went there at night and he could have blown the whole thing up in 30 seconds. So there is a real threat, and one of the most progressive reformers on this issue is the American military, because they understand the impact of this. So we've all seen Katrina and the impact, and this recent spill in West Virginia, the chemical spill. I don't know if you know, I only learned recently from the Utility Workers of America that the reason that the chemicals could not be removed and the spill could not be stopped sooner was because the infrastructure, the water pipes, were so deteriorated that they couldn't turn off the water. So of course, hand in hand with climate change and the impact that it's having is the fact that our infrastructure is so deteriorated that we don't have what it takes to be resilient against any of these kinds of storms. The spill in West Virginia, the shrimpers in Louisiana. I don't know if you know that last summer they were going to have to close the Mississippi River. It would have been $3 billion a day in lost commerce. And the Army Corps of Engineers came, and they were able to drill it to dredge it, just barely. So I don't know what will happen this summer to the Mississippi River, but you can imagine what would have happened to the families who live up and down and depend on that river for their livelihood. 3 meat packing processing factories have closed in Texas in the last year because there's no grass for the cows. And we've seen what happened to the First Nations land in Alberta with the drilling of that oil and the wildfires that are happening in my state of California and other states in the West. And I heard one of you was from Detroit. I'd like you to describe the Petcoke cloud that hangs over your city. So I don't know how much evidence it takes to persuade all of us that this is a real issue. I do know that the Koch brothers, speaking of Jackie's, what'd you call it, the Kochtopus, or they're spending $200 million a year to say it's not an issue. That's just their PR campaign. That, of course, does not take into account what they're going to spend in these elections coming up. So the impact disproportionately is on low-wage workers of color. It also is disproportionately hits in the South. 55% of African Americans live in the South, and southern cities are more subject to climate disaster by a 4-to-1 ratio. There's multiple studies that people of color, the elderly, lower income people, and women perceive the risks of climate change, but are less likely to have the resources to respond to warnings. Therefore, they respond more slowly if they respond at all, and then they suffer greater injuries and higher mortality rates, and it's much more difficult for those families to recover afterwards. There was a study in 2008 by the Environmental Justice and Climate Initiative found that heat-related deaths among African Americans is 150 to 200% higher than that of white people. People of color live in neighborhoods that have a 38% higher level of pollution. I don't know what it takes for us to be persuaded that we have a big problem and we have to take some action. So I've been really struck since I've been here by the extraordinary courage that the people who were here 50 years ago and all of you who have done the work since have, and what strategic initiatives you advanced, including the Freedom Schools, which I know are still going on today. We need a freedom school about climate change. Because if you're an ordinary American like I am, you know, I recycle. And I drive an electric car. And before a year and a half ago, if you had said, well, you know, what are you going to do about it? I would have said, I don't know. What can I do about it? My children have asked me, well, Mom, what can we do about it? So I've been thinking about what we can do about it. Because the truth is, even though these problems are so significant, there are real solutions. We can avoid, not completely, but we can avoid the cooking of the planet. So the man who started Next Gen Climate, Tom Steyer, has a mathematical proposition. And what he would say to you if he were here is we have about 25 years, according to all of the science. We have about 25 years before it really is irrevocable. Before the degree, you know, all the scientists say the Earth should not get to more than 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5% Fahrenheit, which is why 350.org, if you know about their great work, how they came up with that number. And what they say is we have to fix this because in 25 years we're going to be beyond 350. We'll probably be beyond 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have to start now. And so if you take the math, we have 25 years to fix this, which means we have to reduce our fossil fuel emissions by 4% every year. Now that's a manageable number. We could get together in this room, and you all know a lot more than I do about this. I don't know enough about the science, but I know a little bit about organizing. And together we could figure out how to reduce this by 4% a year, except for we're not going to do it this year. And so then next year, we have to do it by 5%. And the year after that, we have to do it by 6%. And in 10 years from now, it very well could be almost impossible to achieve what we have to achieve in the amount of time that we have left. So that's why this problem is urgent. When I was a young organizer and Mike and Heather were teaching me, they said, you have to organize around a problem that is urgent. They also said you have to organize around a problem that's immediate, that people are experiencing right now. And we have a problem in this area because the problems that people are experiencing right now seem more important than this problem. If I don't have a job and I can't support my family and I can't put food on the table and I have to make the hard choices about whether or not I'm going to send my child to college or be able to support my family, those are choices that are much more imminent and present. And if I live in California, which I do, I know something about wildfires, but I don't know anything about sea rise. If you live in Florida, you know something about sea rise, but you don't know anything about the problems of the drought that people in the Midwest are facing. And so it's very hard to come up with a national program that makes sense to people, except that climate change is absolutely tied to income inequality. And if we don't do something about it, it will be much worse. So we have to organize together. We can conserve and we can achieve energy efficiency and we can create wind and solar and green buildings. We can all drive hybrids. We can grow food locally and we can improve farming and forestation and we can repair the infrastructure. But what we have to really do is drive investment and good jobs into the places that have been devastated or are dependent right now on fossil fuels. Because if you go to West Virginia or to the coal mines in any state and you say, you know what, I'm going to be able to get you a good job, that you will be able to support your family in a clean energy technology, they're going to say, not in West Virginia. You might be able to do that somewhere else. So we have to drive investment into the communities that are now dependent on fossil fuels. If we don't do that, we can't persuade those families that their livelihoods will be protected, and we have to do that in order to win. Is this making sense? I'm just learning how to talk about this, so I want you to see what works and what doesn't. So we need a strategy of how to drive a program of resilience and adaptation, as well as a transition to clean energy that could produce many of the distributive benefits that the WPA did during the New Deal, which it created millions of jobs for unemployed people. We have to train people for jobs for the future, but the problem is you have to create the jobs. Jobs drive job training. Job training does not drive jobs. And we have to be clear about that. And as I said, we have to drive this investment to the communities that most need it. And we have to elect people to office who are squarely on our side and who are committed to dealing with income disparity and holding themselves accountable to the pledges they make to us. So how are we going to do this? A few days ago, the President said that climate change requires competent and vigorous action. And Winston Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing after they try everything else. We don't have time to try everything else. We really don't. Go back to the math. A lot of great work has really been done. And last week, the President took decisive action on limiting emissions, but it doesn't really begin until 2030. It was an extraordinary act of courage, but it doesn't begin for 10 more years. So we at NextGen Climate stand on the shoulders of the work that's already been done by each of you in your communities. the work that was done beginning 50 years ago on civil rights, because this is a civil right issue. And my brother and my sister to my left have pointed out about environmental justice is a civil rights issue. But all of the work that we've done up to now is insufficient to solve the problems that we have to solve. The environmental organizations have done so much, but they are primarily white and middle class. And unless we organize in communities of color, and by the way, African Americans and Latinos, by over 70% poll that they want to do something about climate change because they understand what's at stake. So I think our strategy has to be to link income and environmental injustice. And if we intend to restore our democracy and save the planet, which the Koch brothers and their ilk are attacking by going after the labor movement, and particularly public employee unions, by going after progressive leaders, and by taking away our right to vote and denying immigrant families a pathway to citizenship. If we want to drive towards a program of resilience and adaptation and this green transition we've been talking about, we need a new coalition. I just don't see any other way. We need to ID the organizations that have capacity in communities of color and have talented leaders and organizers and ask them to organize around climate. And we need to ID the national environmental organizations that have resources and understand the science and ask them to be more inclusive. And we need to win by taking out the science deniers that Jackie had up there, every one of them and more, and electing governors and congressional leaders and mayors and public utility commission officials who will drive what it takes. So we at Next Gen Climate Action are going to work in 7 states. Mississippi is not one of them. Unfortunately, I have to say this to my brother, Derek. But that doesn't mean the work here isn't equally important. And we're going to drive voter registration, and we want your help in driving action in environmental justice campaigns, and we need people to vote. We can do this if we set our minds to it. The question is, are we going to set our minds to it? It's really urgent. I have 3 kids. And I don't have any grandkids, but in 100 years from now, I will believe that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will hold us accountable for the state of the planet. This will be our legacy, one way or the other. And I don't know about you, but I want to make sure that they inherit the earth. So what I want to thank you for is for caring about this and for being here, for having your soul in the room. And by that, I don't mean the one at the bottom of your feet. I mean the one in your heart. Because that's what it's going to take. And I'd really want to shut up now so that you can give us your ideas and you can tell us what you think. And particularly for those of you who are young in the room, I hope you'll also stand up and speak to us about what it's going to take to organize young people around this and these other issues which are interrelated and inextricably connected. And I hope that you'll organize, because that's what this is, in the end, going to take. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our speakers. I knew you would bring it, and we really appreciate that. So we really do want to open up the floor both to questions and to comments. We have about about 39 minutes left in our time together, and we want to talk about what's going to make these comments relevant to what's happening in Mississippi, as well as recognizing that folks here are from different places, so you might have comments to talk about how to implement in other places as well. One thing that we have been in the same vein talking about in my slide, I talk about senators and talk about Congress members and we talk about the policy impacts, but we also need to talk about, especially as it relates to environmental justice issues, who's making decisions around some of these policies, like who's on the zoning boards, for example, who's on the public utilities commissions and the public services commission, who is in control of the rural electric co-ops. I actually have an article that I printed out in my gross disadvantage of the hotel printer, but so I'll send around the few copies that I have. You can take a look at it. But it's an article from 1996, and it's called A Question of Power, Race and pardon? Oh, thank you. It's okay. 1 second. Thank you okay. It's called A Question of Power, Race and Democracy in Rural Electric Co-ops. And what's interesting is that even though this article is from 1996, in terms of the racial compositions of the rural electric co-ops, nothing has changed, literally, in terms of actually having on the rural electric co-op boards better representation in terms of race representation. So with that, I will open up the floor, but I have to do some logistics here. But and so if folks want to put their hands up, and then I'll call on a few people, and then we'll do the, pardon? Right. So people do have to go to the microphone. So maybe if people could just line up at the microphone to the extent that you want to ask any questions or make any comments.
Well, I was probably going to wait for some other people to jump in because I'm going to be a little controversial, I think, which is probably a good thing here, right? And I want to speak a word that I haven't heard at this conference that seems relevant to me when we talk about the question of climate change. The word is capitalism, and I think it's something we have to talk about, an economic system which is driving climate change. And it drives climate change. I think everybody has noticed that the economy doesn't work unless it's expanding. And everybody's talking about growing the economy, and we're talking about shrinking the use of fossil fuels. Those two things don't tend to go together, and I don't think it's any accident that the folks in Congress who are in the Senate, who are the representatives of the richest section of this country, are the biggest climate deniers and the biggest heel draggers on this problem. So a big piece, I want to be positive too, a big piece of what we have to work out, and I know there are people in this room who are working on this, and I'd like to hear from them, is alternative models of economic development, which include cooperative and sustainable agriculture, and things that are designed for people to share and use and make a living that way. Rather than to make profits and create jobs because the workers are going to generate profits. And it's a challenge to this question of how do we drive investment? What are we investing in? What are we going to try to invest in? So I just want to pose the question. I think my own tendencies and inclinations are clear from the way I pose the question, but I hope others will comment on that too.
Let me just say a word to that, which is that, I spend half my time working for Next Gen Climate Action, and I spend the other half of my time working for SEIU. So I am deeply concerned about these issues as you are. And we are doing some research, and the Center for Labor Sustainability has just issued a very great report about this. They looked at jobs along the Keystone Pipeline that could be created. Alternative jobs. And there are more jobs in clean energy in this country right now than in oil and coal combined, as an example. But as you say, the profits are not the same. Anyway, I'm interested in other people's thinking.
I have just one response on that. So on the question of capitalism, this is something that I plan to explore a lot at my blog at grist.org. I don't have an answer to your question because I don't know works other than capitalism. That just might be owed to my own ignorance. But one question that I do grapple with, especially in the context of Freedom Summer, is how do civil rights operate, civil rights laws operate, dance with the way that markets work today? I think that there's a crucial conflict there that we keep running up against, whether that's in the environmental world or the education world or the housing world. And it's that the time period in which these civil rights laws were created in the 1960s were created at a time where markets were not as, they weren't as hyper-focused on accelerated growth and development as they are today. And so I think often what we find are the frustrations of a lot of civil rights groups, at least from the lawyers and the advocates that I speak to, is they're going to court and they can only get so far because the laws that were created they don't apply apples for apples with how the markets are running today. And I think that that's a huge issue that needs to be addressed because it doesn't seem like the markets are slowing down. Even as we transition to a green energy or a clean energy economy, I mean, this thing is just accelerating and accelerating. Civil rights laws have not evolved at the same pace. And so one thing that I will be grappling with, and one thing I would like to learn from the audience is, how can civil rights laws be, how can they evolve, how can they be molded, grafted in a way where they can actually keep up with the pace of accelerated capitalism, accelerated market growth and development. So if anyone has answers about that, please let me know so I can write about it.
One of the questions I ask, I guess we all ask, is where the reservoir of political power can come from to make the coctopus not able to control the country. For me, and it's partly based on my experience of 50 years ago, the faith communities seem to me to be the sleeping giant of American democracy, but pretty well asleep. And one question is how to awake that sleeping giant, and how awakened it would then be able to act. 50 years ago, it made a huge difference. And isolated, deeply conscientious and committed, but isolated acts for civil rights didn't really sweep the country until first the black churches and then other churches and synagogues actually mobilized behind it. So the Shalom Center has been involved in that, obviously. So have several different interfaith organizations, Interfaith Moral Action on Climate and Interfaith Power and Light, both of them in different levels and with different willingnesses to define it as a power struggle. One of the things, Jackie mentioned it, was that we have developed this notion, drawing on what 350.org did around Divest. We took what I think is a deeper step. First of all, deeper because you can't talk about divesting unless you talk about where the money's going. Or as I said yesterday in the workshop on this question, there's no way to say no unless you also say yes. And secondly, deeper because there are a lot of people, first individuals and congregations and even denominations that don't have, quote, investments, don't have enough money to invest. You're two sides of Chicago, So it's very easy to say divest to people who live in Winnetka, but not so easy to say it to people who live on the south side of Chicago, or even totally ordinary middle-class Americans who are barely making it and don't have leftover investment money. So we've talked about, as Jackie said, move our money, protect our planet. We discovered totally by accident that the initials of move our money, protect our planet are Mom and Pop, but that was given by God, not by any human plan. And what we've discovered is we can talk to people far more effectively about starting with their own purchases, with their own bank accounts, and then, yes, where there's investment money, yes. But the question of how to awaken the sleeping giant of the religious communities with the notion that money is a moral issue, and where you put it in protecting the planet and human society. I don't talk about environmental justice. I talk about eco-social justice. The two are totally interwoven. I don't really like the word environment. It means it's in the environs. It's out there somewhere. The reality is there ain't such a thing as out there. Human society and the earth are totally intertwined. So eco-social justice means that they're both intertwined. And I think there are plenty of things in our religious traditions that teach that. The question is how to mobilize that ancient wisdom into our own understanding of how to move our money.
Thank you. So one interesting point is when Josie was talking about not really thinking about race issues. Interestingly enough, as a small child, I remember the first introduction that I had to Winnetka, the first and last time I really heard of Winnetka, was the fact that my grandmother worked in Winnetka as a housekeeper and nanny to families in Winnetka. And it was interesting, it's interesting that we would share the same panel and have that relationship, because I grew up on the south side of Chicago. So it is, interesting worlds. So any other comments? Yes, please. John.
What was the question?
Oh, to the rabbi's thing? Yeah. Let me say that there's a lot of powerful organizing that I know that you know about that is happening through congregations already. If you look at the work that PICO is doing, the Pacific Institute of Community Organizing, or the Industrial Areas Foundation, or Gamalio, or the National People's Action Network, there's a lot of powerful organizing, but it's not around this issue primarily. So that's really what I meant when I was saying one of the things we need to do is go to those organizations that have capacity and talent and leaders and talk with them about the interrelationship, as you would say, Rabbi, between the issues they are organizing around and this issue. I think that's a really important step that we need to take. I also think that there's efforts now, by example, in Los Angeles, to get the Pope to come to Los Angeles and speak about the relationship between these kinds of issues. Because if he would come to the United States and speak, given his moral leadership, that would make a big difference. I read in the Times that a lot of the cardinals are selling their houses. Well, maybe they could reinvest. I think we just have to think of, and I look to your leadership on this, about how to approach the organization of congregations around this issue, because I think it's critical. There is the bishop, I went to see the bishop in San Jose because he put out a letter to his congregants. So I said, well, he's an Irish guy from Ireland, and I said, well, so Bishop, did it work? He said, it's like most things I do. No. So I would look to all of your key responses on this question, because I think it's really important.
I mean, on that note, I'd just like to point out a few of the active religious organizations that I know about personally and that I've reported on. I want to point to Derek Evans right here in the room. If you all haven't seen the documentary, Come Hell or High Water, the story of how Turkey Creek, Mississippi fought off a lot of the development and a lot of other issues that were basically where the state of Mississippi was trying to wipe this historically African-American community off the map. Part of the way that they were able to defend Turkey Creek, Mississippi was by enlisting a lot of the African-American ministers right here in the area who helped with that, join that eco-social justice fight. Also, my father, he's a minister, he's a Baptist minister. He works with the National Baptist Convention. he's worked very hard to get a lot of the Baptist churches around the nation to get involved in this fight. He's also worked with Gamaliel. I reported a few months ago about Reverend Michael Minor, who I don't know if anyone knows who that is, in Hernando, Mississippi, who's been engaged in a huge food justice and climate justice organizing campaign for black churches in the area. So, I mean, I think they're there. It's a matter of going into those communities and seeing what these black ministers are doing. And I didn't live 50 years ago when all of this was happening, but from my little bit of reading of history, I know that Martin Luther King was a little frustrated with the churches at the time because a lot of them were not, I mean, part of when he wrote Why We Can't Wait was aimed at churches because they weren't waking up at the time to the civil rights fight. Yeah, right. So I mean, it's it's not like the church has always been active in these social justice struggles. King struggled with it back then. I don't think Southern Christian Leadership Conference had a whole lot of churches behind it when they first started. But I think that a lot of these churches are doing things in their own communities, and it may not be called climate change, it may not be called climate justice, but they're doing things that, in terms of practical application, they are conserving energy, they are, farming in sustainable ways, they're being conscious about where they buy their products from. And we have to be frank, I mean, churches aren't the cause of climate change to begin with, it's power plants, and they're not investing in power plants. So I think that giant is there and it's awake. We just kind of have to be in the communities to see what they're doing. So.
I just say one last thing about this is that in the political races, there are in both in Massachusetts and Virginia, we organized with the help of evangelical Christian networks, Christian voters around these issues, both in the Massachusetts Senate race and then in the Virginia governor's race, where there was a clear climate denier, and there was real evidence that when you made this an issue in the political campaign, that those voters came out and did the right thing.
Yeah, I was just going to, were you going to talk about the same point? I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
I was just going to add the same thing, which is that the best good news I've heard in the environmental movement in the last 10 years is that born-again Christian congregations are beginning to take it up as part, because the way they frame it is, in order to honor God's creations, they have to protect them.
Very good point. Thank you. So one last point on this. I actually met Pastor Mock or Reverend Mock. Mm-hmm. At a religious leaders summit that the NAACP had organized a few years ago, and it was interesting because just on the point of being able to how we engage with the faith leaders, because during that session I had a reverend who was from Zambia actually, and another reverend from Atlanta, Leroy Barber. I don't know if you know him, but so he does excellent work in the urban areas of Atlanta, and we had a whole curriculum that we developed around climate change, the intersection of climate change and racial justice. And we used lyrics from Marvin Gaye's Ecology song. We used lyrics from, yes, and we used lyrics from Michael Jackson's Earth Song, and we wove it around scripture and so forth, and really had a very robust conversation and used, a lot of real examples of what's happening in communities. And at the end of the conversation, a couple of the reverends said, I'm actually embarrassed and ashamed. They said, Marvin Gaye was talking about this, I don't know how many years ago, and Michael Jackson, a pop singer, was talking about this, and we really had no idea. We weren't able to connect this to what's happening in our communities. So several of them gave that testimony at the end of that conversation. So I don't want to kind of make it seem like they know and they're just ignoring and not taking action. I think we need to also think about how we can better communicate with churches to really bring them on board and really help to contextualize them with the problems that they see every day, so they don't think, like you said, as environment as being something out there. So I think that's an important. Very good question. So we actually need to clean it up. Like, we used it and that was all good, but it was a little raggedy. So we need to clean it up, and we will post it online because a couple of people have asked that same question. Thank you. So yes, please,
one last
John.
quick note on that. Climatologist Catherine Hayhoe, she's done a lot of great climate change work. She's a pure scientist, but she's married to an evangelical minister in Texas, as it were, and they've done a lot to get the evangelical church movement to finally take a position on climate change.
And just on a final practical note, as we were giving examples, there's a church in Mobile, Alabama, that has solar panels on its roof, and they actually have a picture in that same presentation somewhere in there of that church. And there's a set of churches in Longview, Texas, literally 4 hours from here, and I will be going there in a couple of days. And they have a community garden network where all the community gardens are tied to their churches, and the churches are connected to a mission, and they actually grow the food, and they use the food to cook in the mission where they serve indigent members of the community. So, yes.
So I actually want to just express both some frustration but also some hope. In working with the union that I do in New York City, I mean, we're a union of 120,000 members. We've got 50,000 retirees. 80% of our membership are people of color, and yet we're not on board yet with the issue of climate change. It hasn't resonated, and I think, I'd actually like to reach out a little bit and talk more about the messages that you have found that work on this, because it's absolutely critical. And then I'll also, but we do also have, and we have endorsed, I've pushed them to endorse actually, this action in New York City called the People's Climate March, which is going to occur on September the 21st. And it's relevant to this conversation because it is a real effort to pull together a huge community of people. And there is a very large faith participation in that's going on, and a very large youth community, and a very large environmental justice community, and a growing union community. And we're hoping to put 500,000 people to 1 million people on the streets that day. And we're doing it in New York only because that's where the UN is, because this is in parallel to a UN event on Climate Summit, a summit on the climate. And it will be a time to focus this issue not just on New York, not just on the United States, but actually worldwide. And I think that's, to me, the growing sense of how we do, in fact, transition. Because I agree that capitalism is an issue in here and a problem in here, but we're also not going to wait. We don't have the time to wait to solve that problem before we solve the climate problem. But I do believe that if we build community on this, that if we build community across, with all of us joining in together on this issue, with those factions joining in, with our environmental justice issues, with our faith communities and our unions and our workers all over, not just each state, not even just over the country, but in fact around the world, if we recognize this as a world problem, and that we're joined in unison then with the people of Nigeria, with the people of India and Bangladesh, and all the other people of this world that are in fact confronting these issues together. I think that community of spirit will in fact roll back the Koch brothers on this, and that we will in fact transition to a different way of doing business. And in some small, humble way, I hope that this march on the 21st in New York City is one more way of trying to move in that direction. And I should also say, by the way, I have some information on that if people, I can leave it up here, if people are interested in that. But I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to do a gentle pushback on that, because this is something that I grapple with on my blog, and this is something that you brought up also. So I very much understand that, like, we're not going to be able to replace capitalism with something tomorrow, right? But I think that in terms of, when people say, well, we have to solve climate change first before we solve capitalism, or solve this climate first, and then I don't really know how that happens. I mean, capitalism is fueled capitalism fuels climate change. Capitalism fuels racism. Capitalism fuels sexism. It fuels income inequality. There is no capitalism without someone being exploited or without some natural resource being exploited. So I know it's very difficult to kind of try to prioritize and say, well, we have to solve this first and then deal with the other one second. But I'm not sure how that actually works in an applicable framework, especially if we're like building community. Because if we're going to go to people in developing countries and say, well, we need you to kind of put to the side racism and the fact that you can't eat so that we could talk about climate change, I don't know how they're able to do that practically in their life. And so I don't have solutions for that either, so that's, again, something that I would love to learn about, like how people can put their everyday problems that they've been dealing with for centuries to the side to suddenly deal with climate change.
I just want to say a word about the labor movement because it's been my greatest privilege to work for the labor movement for a long time. It's not, again, I think that the trade union movement in this country views these issues depending on what workers you represent. So if you represent workers in the public sector, as I know you and I do, it's easier to have a conversation about it than if you're in the building trades and you are part of the construction of the Keystone Pipeline, by example. We have to be persuasive that there are real, benefited, good jobs that are tangible and are going to be in those communities where coal miners live, where people who are constructing pipelines live. And we can do this if we have the will and if we have the wherewithal to exercise our vote this coming November. If we register hundreds of thousands of people to vote and get them out, we will elect people who will be accountable on this issue and who will provide good jobs. And if we don't, then we've lost another year.
Daniel?
So I know we're sensitive to time. I'm going to read quickly, but I wanted to read a quote that I read last night at Jackson State for their Freedom Fest. It's from a book called Clabbered Dirt and Sweetgrass, and it ties directly into what I care about in agriculture and farming, but also tremendously ties into all this. It's everything we are, all that we can ever be, and I edited it a little bit, so you'll probably get where that came in. All that we are, all that we can ever be, all the Einsteins and babies and love and hate, all the joy and sadness and sex and wanting and liking and disliking, all the soft summer breezes on cheeks and first snowflakes, all the Van Goghs and Rembrandts and Mozarts and Mahlers, Jeffersons, Lincolns, Gandhis, Mandelas, and Jesus Christs, all the Moses, Watkins, the Hammers, the Evers, the Martins, the Malcolms, all the Cleopatras, all the lovemaking, all the riches and achievements and progress, all of that. Every single damn thing that we are or ever will be is dependent on 6 inches of topsoil. And the fact that rain comes when it's needed and does not come when it is not needed, everything, every single thing. So a couple comments and then a question. And one, I'm pretty sure we're at 400 parts per million now, that we've eclipsed it. And that's not to say we're doomed or anything, but that the question now is, how do we get back to that 350 point as soon as possible? Another thing with solar panels and clean energy, we have solar energy producers right now. We've had them for the entire history of life. They're called plants. And we need to use those and not try to circumvent nature or recreate nature because it makes money, and solar panels do make money. They might be better than coal, natural gas, but they're also, in my opinion, not the solution. So talking about systems change and evolution, and I certainly think, and to bring up Michael Jackson again, right, take a look at yourself and make a change. It starts with that person you see when you look in the mirror, and what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to risk? And that's directly tied into what we're here about this week, right? The Freedom Summer, they risked so much, and they sacrificed so much to make a change that was so sorely needed. And I'm very hypocritical and very, very as much to blame as anybody else, but we flew here, we drove here, we are calling home on our iPhones in between sessions. What are we willing to give up for what is really needed as opposed to what we want just because we can get it, not necessarily because we need to have it. And then that ties into a problem I have or an issue I have with just the idea of profit in the first place. And in sustainability and sustainable agriculture where I work, we talk a lot about that triple bottom line of planet, people, and profit. But I'm increasingly more and more confused as to why profit needs to be there. The more you learn about ecology and nature, it seems like in nature there isn't such thing as surplus, which could be translated as waste, excess. It's all there for a reason. It's all used. I mean, compost is a perfect example. It's part of the process. And when we start looking for that surplus, that extra amount, that profit, then we're taking it away from something else, and that's where the exploitation comes in. And I think the best way to do this, and it ties into the sustainable agriculture, but in so many other ways, is to think global. Like, think about how this is affecting other people that we might not see and on a regular basis or experience, but then act local and really You know, if you live in New York or New England, go to the march. But if you don't fly there, and I'm sorry, but start a march in your own community, because you have just as much problems and as much need. So my question, right, after all that, is how do you see population growth as, is it a problem? If it is, what do we do?
I think the problem is the growth of our population. Given that we are 4% of the world's population, but we're responsible for 25% of the global emissions that drive climate change. So, if any population control would need to start, it would need to start right here in the United States. And the issue is that when people talk about population control, they're often talking about controlling the population of people in the global South, and that's where that starts to get to be a problem. But other people might have questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's also when people also, it's the global South. Sometimes it's the United States South. Also, I mean, I'm reading right now about North Carolina's eugenics victims and how the state is paying reparations to them. We have a state lawmaker in Louisiana who, I think almost every year that he's been in office, he's introduced a bill that would limit the amount of children that low-income people could have, black people could have in Louisiana. I mean, that's happening today. I think consumption is probably the bigger issue than population. There's definitely some great debates to be had about population control and growth, but when you kind of look at the genesis of the people who really started that conversation about how to control population, there was a lot of racism at the heart of those discussions. But consumption is a problem today. I mean, if you're just talking about sacrifice. If we sacrifice in terms of how we consume, I think population. Actually, scientists have said, population would not be as big of a problem if we just consume less. Us meaning the United States. Yeah. Or growth. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and that wasn't direct. It was just more that whenever this population conversation gets started, then people often go down that path. So definitely didn't think you were saying control, because I think you were definitely in the right direction when you're talking about. It is very much so.
I appreciated everything you said about sustainable food and plants and all of that. You know, in my office in San Francisco, Tom Steyer has made it a platinum office building. We have a living wall and all of that. But, we can all, it's not enough. We all have to act individually, but it's not enough. We have to organize people around this issue, and we have to organize in ways that make sense to people. All organizing is local, and so I appreciated that point in particular. And I would just say one thing. Unless the United States leads on this issue, there's no reason why the third world countries should even, look at us about these issues, because we do consume so much more than they. And they are developing countries, and a lot of this is our fault. I've been to China 25 times, and I see what burning coal in China is doing. On the other hand, 835 million people in China live on less than $100 a month.
Doesn't that seem like
this contrast.
Leading the civil rights conversation? Like, how can we be advocates for sustainability and green? I don't know if that's possible. I might disagree and say it has to be someone other than the United States.
No, I think if we don't do it, I really believe this. And I'm not saying that efforts aren't happening in other countries, and many countries are way far ahead of us, and I think those are really important. But if we don't do it, it isn't going to happen, just because of the amount of people and the amount of consumption that we have in this country.
So I think Derek. Yeah.
I have two comments. One is religious and one is secular. I'll start with the religious. It may be that this is the time, the period in history in which particularly the religious traditions that rely on and refer to the book of Genesis, which is quite a few people that we're referring to, begin to rethink what the so-called, what do you call it? It's often called the fall of man, from the casting out from the Garden of Eden. And I remember recently in our church, which you mentioned in Turkey Creek, having a discussion about environmental justice and environmental stewardship, and the congregation discovering together that in the book of Genesis and the story that happens there, and then going forward to where we are today, that the purpose of the, in our case, Christian life is to restore the peace, to restore the shalom that existed in the Garden of Eden, which was not just the breakage of a relationship between God and humans who were put here to be the stewards of God's creation, God's earth and its resources, but there was a third part that's always historically been left out, which is that creation itself. It was a three-part relationship. And that the shalom can never be, which is the purpose of our living, can never be regained without regaining or getting back to the shalom, the peace between the Creator, human beings, and creation. And so I think that's a fairly simple and timely theology to propagate at this time when more and more people of faith and not of faith are talking about climate and other things. So that's a nice, simple basis that many people can refer back to. And in our church, it led to a bumper sticker that my cousin Flowers came up with that said, "Clean souls need clean water." Right? Clean souls because they need clean air. Clean souls need, sustainable climate. Right? Okay, that's my religious comment. Now, my secular comment has to do with the nature of civic engagement, protest, change-making, and how we tend to prioritize election cycles. We tend to prioritize litigation, court cases, existing law. We tend to prioritize events as opposed to some of the more organic, continuous, community-based activity that either lend themselves to or don't to a more just and sustainable environment and society. And I'm reminded of when Malcolm X spoke to the young people about a year before the Freedom Summer in his message to the grassroots, and pointed out that any revolution or any social change movement that is not based on land is not about nothing as far as real self-determination and the future of these places. And if he were here today, he would say, and of this planet. Had he known what we know about climate change and the effects of carbon-based fuel and all of this, he would have added this. But even then, it's not a disconnect, because we're talking about space and the usage of resources in land and the impact that they have on us all. And in Turkey Creek, which I would not describe to anybody as a success story yet, right, Roberta? Okay? And which is an ongoing thing, it's instructive, and this is the most instructive and important piece here, is that if we really think about it, in addition to elections and holding office and all of these other ways in which we can engage, we have to make normal and routine what is probably the most important form of civic engagement in this country, which is participation in community planning, land use, permitting, and development. Because every refinery, every wastewater discharge facility, everything built was planned, permitted, and done. So we need citizen planners, right? Not just voters registered, okay? We need people saying and putting on paper ahead of time what they do want to see develop. That's the nature of self-determination, and it is allowed for in this country. That is why areas of counties all over the country decide to pull themselves out of the county and to incorporate as a municipality so that they can have greater local control over future land use, water, and other resource planning and development. And then their idea becomes growth. But growth to what end? But if our people were more actively, proactively, and earlier engaged as a routine behavior that we think of as much as we think of voting as a civic responsibility, the lessons that we have learned in Turkey Creek from simply being at the table and no longer just on the menu is phenomenal and very replicable. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could add one comment to what Derek said, because there's a very clean, clear connection between that participation in urban planning, utility districts, voting rights, and environmental justice. We know that yesterday, or the 25th, was the one-year anniversary of the Supreme Court decision, Shelby versus Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. That was somewhat of an inevitable thing because a few years before that, in 2009, the Voting Rights Act was before the Supreme Court for review in a case where, again, you had a locality that was challenging the legality of the Voting Rights Act, right? That case in 2009 was not about voter ID. It wasn't about voter registration. That case came out of North Austin's utility district. That was specifically about a district specifically created where people are elected to deal with land use, water use, wastewater disposal, and use. That's specifically what that election was about. And that case was called Namundo versus Holder, North Austin Municipality Utility District Number 1 versus Holder. And in that Supreme Court decision, Chief John Roberts basically said that he was going to do what he ended up doing last year, which was he said, if we don't take a look at the coverage formula of the Voting Rights Act, I'm going to gut it. I'm going to get rid of it. And he ended up doing what he said he was going to do. But again, like I know that when it comes to voting rights, I've covered a lot on voting rights, and we like Derek said it, we get, there's a lot about civic engagement that's very important when it comes to voter registration and voting, but a lot of these challenges are happening because people are trying to control the way that water and energy and land use is being decided and permitted. That's where a lot of these voting rights challenges are coming from at the local level.
Just want to say that I totally agree with your assessment that we need to find local organizing in those areas that you identified. And the challenge, I think, is there's a lot of great organizing that's happening in the country already. And the challenge is how to link that up to become a powerful force in American politics. And by that I mean by doing the kind of power shifting that is necessary to win. And I don't mean that just politically, on the issue, in local communities and in states. And then, I think there should be a federal carbon tax. How we get there, we're a long way from there right now if you look at the Congress. But the only way to get there is to do what you've suggested. So I really appreciated your remarks.
So the one quick thing that I would just wanted to say is how the dialogue gets controlled and the verbiage that gets used. And climate change, very ambiguous and inconsequential, as opposed to something like ecological degradation or catastrophe. We talk about climate change. I mean, that's better than global warming because global warming, people go, well, it's getting colder where I live. So it's very easy to deny. So that's just the quick thing. And then as I was standing listening to Derek, a book that I've been reading, written by one of the members of Freedom Summer, Lewis Hyde, called The Gift. Really wonderful book. I've only gotten about 20 pages into it because it's very rich and very dense. But what I've read so far already really speaks to what Derek was saying about bringing back the shalom, the peace of the Garden of Eden. And Lewis is speaking specifically about gift economies versus barter economies and the importance of the social cohesion that's created in economies where, and he's working specifically with Papua New Guinea as one of his key focuses, and talking about how you give these things away and they get augmented, if they are passed on, and when they're held on to, they lose their power, they degrade, and that in giving the thing away, you're giving it to, there has to be at least 3 parties involved. You have to give it to someone who gives it to someone else. Eventually, the shell necklaces that they're giving make it around the island circuit and they'll come back. But the whole idea is that there's a mystery, there's an unknowing, as opposed to a barter system, which they are also very much involved with, of haggling and bartering, but this is something very different. And it speaks to that idea of a 3-part, where there's the humanity, the creator, and the creation. So I would suggest checking that book out as well. Just some thoughts on what you were saying. Thanks.
I just wanted to ask a question. I'm from a rural Northern California county, about 2 hours above Sacramento, and we decided a year ago to do an anti-fracking initiative. We sit on top of one of the largest watersheds in the West. The water that flows through our county and around our county, very close to it, supplies all of agribusiness in the Central Valley of California, which is the nation's breadbasket and veggie basket. And it supplies almost all of the water to Southern California, which I used to live in for 30 years, and it's all built on a desert. So, you know, there's no natural water to supply expanding Los Angeles, San Bernardino, San Diego, the Inland Empire, any of it. So we thought it was pretty important that the water that flows throughout the whole state not be chemically polluted. We did a campaign and we framed it not as an anti-fracking initiative, but as a protecting our water initiative. We gathered over 100,000 signatures in 11 weeks. We thought we had 6 months, but the wording of the initial petition had some legal weaknesses in it, and we had to start all over again. The whole petition process ended like a week before I came here. About 3 days before I came here, it was completely thrown out by the county clerk. Because number one, we didn't put it in bold print, even though everybody who signed obviously could understand the petition content. And secondly, we didn't have a section that said, and therefore to enact this measure, we must do X, Y, Z. Now, we had all the parts of what was going to have to happen to enact it. We just didn't call it enacting phrase. So it was all thrown out, and people are just going like this. During that time, we found out that an oil company, a single oil company in Houston, had pumped in $100,000 into our rural county to thwart this effort. And they funneled it through our right-wing state senator and our extreme right-wing Tea Party federal congressman. They created a phony community organization called Taxpayers for Lower Energy Costs or something like this. So they're trying to confuse people that if you don't frack, you have less, your gas prices are going to be higher, which is crazy because the fracked gas that comes up gets turned into liquid natural gas and shipped to China because they can make big money on it and doesn't really change the fuel mixture locally. So they spent $100,000 before we even qualified the petition. We could not get enough legal help early enough from the statewide anti-fracking environmental groups or from any of the other environmental organizations with legal talent. We are now being told that if we challenge it legally, if we appeal it, it will cost us $25,000. We have $2,000 in the campaign's bank account. It's absolutely impossible. We will never win that fight. They have all the money in the world to fight as long as they want to fight with 50 attorneys working against us. So we're going to try to get the Board of Supervisors to pass it because we succeeded in 4 out of 5 of them taking a vote to direct their staff to draft language banning fracking in the county. And the reason that happened, we thought we had 3 votes for stronger regulation of it. When one of the Republican supervisors said, I don't think we ought to regulate it, I think we ought to ban the whole thing. Turns out he had a niece who died in Hinckley, Erin Brockovich's Hinckley, from the chromium poisoning. But I just, there's nothing I can, there's not a concrete question, but we are in a total dilemma about what to do. We have mobilized 100,000 signatures in 11 weeks in a very rural Greene County, which is about 55% red. Has 4 Tea Party groups in the county that I know of already. I've been to 3 of them. But anybody with any ideas on what the hell we do now? Because obviously we have to unmask the fact that the right wing, I mean, essentially, I want a headline that says, Houston Oilers declare war on Butte County. I mean, it's an oil company in Houston dictating, one company dictating to what we should do in this northern rural county. But anybody that has any advice or similar experience, please talk to me. Or you guys have any brilliant guidance for us. Thank you.
So I just want to let the gentleman speak as well, and then maybe we can answer both questions at the same time. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
No, I was saying I think we just want to let the gentleman speak as well, and then we'll answer both questions at the same time. Sure.
Hey, how's everybody doing tonight? First, I want to thank y'all for coming to speak. I have 2 questions, actually. One, I wanted to catch the name of that article again.
Risky business.
Risky business. Okay, thank you. 2, first, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Blake Peter Stoner. I'm a rising sophomore at Morehouse College. Right now, I'm in the process of making an organization called ONE, stands for Only Negotiate Equality. And one of the 4 essential pillars of ONE is environmental consciousness. And with that, I have a question, a general question for anyone who can help me or guide me. I know we have spoke a lot on how to implement these ideas of environmental improvements into the minority communities. So I want to know, what are the first steps to take to do that? And if anyone can help me, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, so let me just speak to the sister from Butte County. I gave you my card, but we're running a campaign called Fair Shake at Next Gen Climate in California. What we want is for people to get a fair shake from the oil companies, and it doesn't seem like the people of Butte County are doing that. So I hope that we can sit down and think about what tactics and what strategy could be helpful in going forward on this together. I know Carson, yeah.
It's a Southern California multiracial city that banned fracking with a unanimous vote at the city council. Governor Brown, who's linked to the oil industry and is not an environmentalist, called the mayor of Carson, had a 30-minute conversation with them, and all of a sudden the ban on fracking is gone. That just tells you the power of the oil industry.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think EPA is reviewing its rules or its policies around fracking, whether and how and where it can happen. I don't have a specific solution for it, but I know in general, just kind of as a leading thought on just all environmental solutions. I mean, one thing I know that EPA really encourages is public comments. Right now they're delivering a lot of regulations, not only on how they regulate fracking, but on how they regulate existing power plants, new power plants, local emissions, climate change emissions. And I know that they take pretty seriously the comments that they get. The oil companies and the industries often like to pad those comments, but as Derek mentioned yesterday, people power is real. And if 50 years ago and during Freedom Summer, people flooded down to get people to register to vote, going next door to door to register people to vote, it's possible that we could do the same thing in terms of public comments, like going to people's homes and helping them understand, okay, this rule is about to happen, this is what you need to know about it, and it would be really great if we could submit a public comment about it so EPA knows that your community is going to be affected and you want something done about it. I mean, whether that ultimately solves the problem or not, I can't, obviously attest to that. But I know that public comments is one thing that kind of really goes under the radar in our communities.
I know that
answer his question.
Okay, so I think a number of the folks in the room can comment on this question around organizing with communities of color, because definitely Yassine and Roberta and Derek are people that I've worked with in terms of organizing with communities of color. So I definitely don't want to dominate this this question. But some of the work that we're doing include. I mean, it's been interesting, just kind of the journey of connecting. Even so, unless you're actually living in a community that's in the shadow of a, where the water's polluted and the air is very clearly polluted, and folks are, you're living in a cancer cluster or whatever, a lot of times the notion of environment is not one that some of the communities are really necessarily connecting to. And even some of the communities that are living in those kind of places aren't necessarily kind of tying this all together. So it's been, as the NAACP, at the beginning, we were challenged with kind of having a conversation around how this affects civil rights. When I first started, I would put on our regional meetings, I would put Climate Justice 101 as the name of our session. And at the end of one of the workshops, someone came up to me and said, "Oh, I thought this was going to be about the climate of workplace discrimination." So like the notion of climate justice didn't at all register as even something that we would talk about. In another session, they said, "Oh, I thought this was going to be about the climate of injustice in the world," because at least they got the justice piece, So it's been a journey, really kind of tying this to real lives and real experiences. So did you want to? Oh, I thought you had your hand up. No, okay. So and we really have had to engage around having conversations with communities and really collecting stories and talking about weaving a narrative around the lived experiences of communities as it relates to these things. So whether we're talking about, whether we're in a room and asking people to raise their hand if they know someone with asthma, and you'll see the result as being pretty pervasive in a lot of these communities, but because they've lived in those communities all their lives, they don't really realize that if you went into another room, that no one would raise their hand, or that just a couple people would raise their hand versus everybody raising their hand. So we're having a conversation about that, the difference between the experiences in those communities versus other communities. Talking about the fact that, that any number of people in the room will know someone who died of lung cancer but never smoked a day in their lives. So really starting to talk about that, and then unpacking like what that actually means in terms of the lives of in terms of what the drivers are of those kind of experiences. So really talking through people's experiences has been the way that we've been able to connect people to this issue, and then really talk about an action agenda around it. So those are just a couple of examples, but of course there's a whole kind of program built around it. And also on the action side, helping those actions to tie with other things that people are experiencing in their community. So when we talk about, we were just talking before we started with Brenton and Thina, because Thina works on the school to prison pipeline, and we were talking about how when these kids are living in communities where, they have asthma, they're out of school, X number of days every year, so therefore, or they're in school, but they have a hard time learning because they're lead exposed, and therefore they have attention deficit disorder, and what that means in terms of their possibility of advancement in school. And if, some studies show that if you're not on grade level by the third grade, your chances of entering into the prison or to the criminal justice system is greater. And then when you tie that to the metals that go into the air that are emitted by these coal plants and so forth, and yes, and pesticides in California being another example. And those metals, if you actually Google metals and violence, you'll actually see that the breathing in those metals and taking those into your body actually is related to increase in violent behavior. So starting to weave all those kind of experiences that people have every day and that they consider to be the most urgent experience in their lives to these environmental exposures that they're having is real and relevant for folks. So, and then talking about even food prices and really just getting real about that. Like, what does your budget for food look like now versus what it looked like before? Talking about how droughts and how that ties to climate change. Not to mention the fact that we're more likely to have our homes in floodplains and flood zones. And so as we see this rise in flooding, even today, if you turned on the news this morning, the whole Midwest is underwater, in terms of all these communities. And again, it's going to be communities of color, because we property values are lower in floodplains. That's where we can afford to buy, et cetera, et cetera. And speaking on property values, again, tying back to Thina and this conversation with Thina and Brenton, that if you live next to a toxic facility, your property values are average 15% less than if you're not living next to a toxic facility. 71% of African Americans live in communities that are in violation of air standards by the Clean Air Act, which are insufficient anyway. And so when we have lower property values, that then ties back to our school systems. We have under-resourced schools because the school systems are paid for by property taxes. So all of this stuff completely interlinked together. And so those are those kind of conversations that help communities to make those linkages. Yeah. So, in sum.
I'm very glad that you're doing what you're doing and that you asked the question that you asked. Because 50 years ago, when you were probably about this gentleman's age, you couldn't, and the rest of y'all could not have imagined the litany of additional layers to this crisis of humanity, democracy, the environment that he is trying to figure out how to engage community people to deal with. And so first, our prayers are with you, and so is our support. And in that vein, my simple suggestion is this, and it comes from my mother, who oftentimes reminds me that I appear to sometimes love our problems more than I love their possible solutions. Because I can, and we can, and all of us can, rattle off with increasing clarity and accuracy as the information comes out, right? The parts per million, the number of disenfranchised voters, on and on and on. All of the different, those who are paying attention and engaged, the different data and causes and effects of things. But I think the answer to your question has to go far beyond those problems and far back to a place that we were talking about yesterday, where, it's hard to catch a horse when it's left a barn, even though you have to in the case of climate change. It's hard to do. What's easier to do is, was it Malcolm again? No, it was Frederick Douglass, who said that it is easier to raise a healthy child than to fix a broken man, right? And think of our society and our planet as a child that we're raising, or a man that's broken, either one. It's easier to start before the horse leaves the barn, before the particular. See, we're talking about climate now. On the Mississippi Gulf Coast where I live, we weren't really talking about climate. Say at the time of Katrina, we were talking about disaster, or we were talking about these other sort of words that historically get presented to us by the urgency, the latest, science, or the latest news of bad news, right, for our region and our planet. I guess what I'm getting at is the solution, I think, has to do with whomever you engage in your group, your organization, your peers. The real prize, keeping your eyes on the prize, is to have them do what was done during Freedom Summer, to have people love, value, and embrace self-determination. Have them love and embrace their environment. It might not be engaging them initially in a conversation about climate change. It might be about the birds in the community that they live in, if that's a good teaching point for the children or the young people. Or it may have to do with something, an asset that's positive that they can enjoy, like a community garden, or more walking, better, healthier food, whatever it is. But I think people tend to become more engaged when they're engaged in a positive way that induces them to love and value something. They will then defend it. It's hard to jumpstart folks to defend something that they don't quite yet know or understand as a problem. All right? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I would just say one thing, which is, as an organizer, the best thing to do is ask people. Just ask them what they think and what are they concerned about. and they'll give you an answer, and then you can find a road. Just ask.
Could you go to the mic, because she's filming it very much.
Lastly, I would just offer to you, and this is on a much smaller level, but around opportunity. I think that too. Sometimes you start from the solution and work your way back. So being young and having that feature in front of you, you can engage people, I think, much more in minority communities, males. Everybody knows after the Recovery Act, all the money went into weatherization and those kind of talks. So just around the opportunity and the possibilities that it holds for the future, and then how to make that opportunity real is going back and really pointing out all the problems that exist with the way it's being done now. So that may work a lot more in minority communities, at least it does with mine.
Thank you very much. So we are 28 minutes over time. So really hats off to all of you who are so interested that you stuck with us. And so it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Hopefully everyone signed up on the notebook because you can get the notes, so yeah. So otherwise, thank you all, and thank you very much to our speakers. So take care, everyone.